The door closed before I could even set the cake down on the step. Through the glass, I watched my son's back as he walked away from me, his shoulders rigid with a finality that made my chest tighten. "We don't celebrate with you anymore, Mom." That's what Michael had said just moments before, his voice flat and emotionless, like he was declining a magazine subscription instead of rejecting 35 years of birthday traditions. I stood there on his front porch, holding the vanilla cake with lemon buttercream frosting, his absolute favorite since he was 6 years old, feeling the warmth of it seep through the white bakery box into my cold, trembling hands. The October wind whipped around me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't process what had just happened. This wasn't just any cake. I'd spent 3 hours that morning perfecting the lemon buttercream the way his great-grandmother had taught me when I was a young bride. I'd used real vanilla beans, the expensive ones I save for special occasions. I'd piped delicate rosettes around the edges and written "Happy 35th Birthday, Michael" in the careful script I'd practiced for decades. If you're listening to this, please subscribe to this channel. I need to know, have you ever given your all to someone, only to have them hand it back to you like it was nothing? Have you ever stood on a doorstep, holding a piece of your heart disguised as a birthday cake, watching the person you'd die for close the door in your face? Because that's exactly what happened to me on October 15th, and it changed everything. Not just about my relationship with my son, but about how I saw myself, how I valued my own love, and what I was willing to accept from the people I'd spent my whole life serving. That cake was still warm when he rejected it. Still warm, like the love I'd been pouring into every birthday, every holiday, every moment of his life for 35 years. But sometimes, the most devastating moments become the most liberating ones. Sometimes, when someone hands your love back to you and says they don't want it anymore, you finally realize something you should have known all along. Maybe it's time to stop giving it away to people who don't treasure it and start saving some of that sweetness for yourself. This is the story of the day my son broke my heart with 6 words and how that broken heart finally taught me to love myself. You have to understand, baking has been my love language for as long as I can remember. My kitchen isn't just a room in my house. It's my sanctuary, my temple, the place where I transform flour and sugar and butter into edible expressions of everything I feel but can't always say. My grandmother Rose taught me to bake when I was 7 years old, standing on a wooden step stool beside her massive farmhouse stove. "Margaret," she'd say, her flour-dusted hands guiding mine, "when you put love into the batter, people can taste it. They might not know what makes your cake different from the store-bought ones, but their hearts will know." Michael was barely walking when he discovered my chocolate chip cookies cooling on the kitchen counter. I found him one afternoon, barely 2 years old, with chocolate smeared from ear to ear, having somehow climbed onto a chair and devoured half a dozen cookies. Instead of scolding him, I laughed until tears ran down my cheeks and baked another batch just for him. But it was his 6th birthday that cemented our tradition. I'd spent the entire previous day making his first big boy cake, 3 layers of vanilla sponge with fresh strawberries and cream between each layer. When I carried it into the dining room, candles blazing, Michael's face lit up like I'd handed him the moon itself. After he blew out the candles, he grabbed a handful of frosting and smeared it across his cheeks like war paint, giggling with pure, unbridled happiness. "Mommy makes the best cakes in the whole universe," he declared, and my heart swelled so large I thought it might burst right out of my chest. From that day forward, no matter what else was happening in our lives, I baked Michael's birthday cake. When he was 12 and going through his "I'm too cool for family parties" phase, I still made the cake. When he was 17 and barely speaking to me because I wouldn't let him take the car to a party, I still made the cake. When he was 22 and brought home his first serious girlfriend, I made the cake and taught her the family frosting recipe. Even after he married Chloe, even after they moved across town and started their own little family, I kept the tradition alive. 29 consecutive birthday cakes, each one made with the same careful attention, The same secret ingredient my grandmother had taught me about. Love, stirred in with every fold of the batter. This year, for his 35th birthday, I decided to try something special. Instead of his usual chocolate buttercream, I was going to make lemon buttercream frosting using a recipe I'd found in one of my grandmother's old cookbooks. Real lemons, fresh butter, and a technique that required patience and precision, the kind of challenge that made baking feel like an art form. I called Michael's house 3 days before his birthday to confirm what time I should arrive for the family dinner. We'd done this same dance for years. I'd bring the cake, Chloe would cook dinner, and we'd gather around their dining room table to celebrate another year of my son's life. But this time, Chloe answered the phone with a strange hesitance in her voice. "Oh, Margaret, hi. About Michael's birthday. It's just going to be a very small thing this year, very last minute. You know how it is." I offered to bring the cake like I had every year for nearly 3 decades. There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than comfortable, before Chloe's voice came back, carefully measured. "Don't trouble yourself, Margaret. We've got everything covered this year." But I baked it anyway. Because that's what mothers do, isn't it? We hold on to hope, even when the signs are pointing toward heartbreak. We believe that our love, expressed through our hands and our time and our grandmother's recipes, will somehow bridge whatever distance has grown between us and the children we raised. I spent that entire morning in my kitchen, measuring and mixing and whisking, convinced that when Michael saw his favorite cake, made with extra care and a new frosting technique, he'd remember why our tradition mattered. I believed that love, properly baked and beautifully presented, could overcome whatever was making his wife sound so distant on the phone. I drove to Michael's house that Thursday evening with the cake box secured in the passenger seat of my old Honda, the way I'd transported birthday cakes for years, but something felt different this time. The usual excitement, that flutter of anticipation I always felt when delivering one of my creations, was replaced by a knot of anxiety sitting heavy in my stomach. The cake had turned out beautifully, perhaps the most beautiful I'd ever made. The lemon buttercream was perfect, pale yellow and silky smooth, piped into delicate rosettes around the border. I'd written "Happy 35th Birthday, Michael" in my best script across the top and even added tiny fondant roses that had taken me an extra hour to craft. This wasn't just a birthday cake. It was a masterpiece born from 35 years of motherly devotion. But when I pulled into Michael's driveway at exactly 6 o'clock, the time we'd agreed upon years ago for birthday celebrations, the house looked wrong. Too quiet, too dark. There were no other cars in the driveway, no warm lights glowing from the dining room windows, no sounds of family gathering drifting from inside. For a moment, I sat in my car, staring at the house where my son lived with his wife and my 10-year-old granddaughter, Emma. This was the house I'd helped them buy, the house where I'd babysat Emma countless evenings, the house where we'd celebrated holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday dinners for the past 8 years. I carried that cake box like it contained precious cargo, walking up the familiar brick pathway I'd traversed hundreds of times before. The October air was crisp, and I could smell someone else's dinner cooking, pot roasts and onions from the neighbors, probably. It should have been a comforting evening, the kind of autumn night perfect for family celebrations. I rang the doorbell and waited, listening for the usual sounds. Emma's feet running to see who was at the door, Chloe calling from the kitchen, Michael's deep voice saying, "Mom's here," with genuine warmth. Instead, there was silence, long enough that I began to wonder if anyone was home. Then I heard heavy footsteps, deliberate and slow, and the door opened to reveal my son standing there in his work clothes, still wearing his tie from the office. Michael's expression when he saw me wasn't joy or surprise or even mild annoyance. It was something much worse. It was discomfort mixed with what looked almost like guilt. He didn't smile. He didn't invite me in. He just stood there in the doorway, blocking my view of the house interior, looking like I was a door-to-door salesperson rather than his mother arriving for his birthday celebration. "Mom," he said, and that single word carried a weight I'd never heard before. "What are you doing here?" "It's your birthday, sweetheart," I said, holding up the cake box with hands that had suddenly started trembling. "I made your favorite, the vanilla cake with the lemon buttercream frosting I told you about." Michael looked at the cake box like it was something dangerous, something he needed to handle carefully to avoid an explosion. Behind him, I could see into their living room. No decorations, no signs of celebration, no indication that this was a special day worth marking. "Mom," he said again, and this time his voice carried a finality that made my chest tighten with dread. "We don't celebrate with you anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward, nearly dropping the cake that had taken me hours to perfect. "What do you mean?" I whispered, though some part of me already knew exactly what he meant. "We've decided we need space. We're doing things differently now, celebrating with different people. It's nothing personal, Mom. We need different traditions." Different traditions, different people, nothing personal. I stood there on his doorstep, holding a cake that represented 35 years of unconditional love, and watched my son explain why that love was no longer welcome in his life. He spoke like he was delivering a business presentation, clinical and detached, as if he wasn't destroying something sacred between us. "But, Michael," I managed to say, "it's your birthday. I've made your cake every year since—" "I know, Mom, but that was then. This is now." And then, before I could respond, before I could ask why or when this decision had been made or what I'd done wrong, Michael stepped back into his house and gently but firmly closed the door. Not slammed. That would have been angry, emotional, something I could have understood. No, this was worse. This was a careful, deliberate closing, the kind you do when you're shutting out something you no longer want to deal with. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, staring at that closed door, holding a birthday cake that would never be eaten by the person it was made for. Through the front window, I could see Michael walking back toward the kitchen, his shoulders relaxed now that the unpleasant task of rejecting his mother was completed. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and stop signs that I barely registered. The cake sat in the passenger seat, still perfect, still beautiful, still warm from my kitchen and my heart. But now it felt like evidence of my own foolishness, proof that I'd been living in a fantasy where my love still mattered to the little boy who used to smear frosting on his cheeks. When I pulled into my own driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, engine off, staring at that cake box. The smell of vanilla and lemon that had filled me with such pride that morning now made me feel sick to my stomach. 35 years of birthday cakes, 35 years of pouring my love into batter and frosting and sugar, and it had all been leading to this moment. Sitting alone in my car, holding a rejected cake, finally understanding that the little boy who used to call me the best baker in the universe had grown into a man who didn't want me in his life anymore. I made it as far as my kitchen table before the dam finally broke. Not tears, those would come later. No. This was something deeper, more devastating. This was the moment when all the little warning signs I'd been ignoring, all the small rejections I'd been explaining away, suddenly arranged themselves into a pattern so clear, it took my breath away. Sitting there with that perfect, unwanted cake still in its box, I forced myself to do something I'd been avoiding for months, maybe years. I made myself remember. I made myself see what had really been happening in my family. Peace. Last Thanksgiving, I'd arrived at Michael's house with my grandmother's stuffing recipe, the one that had been the centerpiece of our family meals for 3 generations. Chloe met me at the door with an apologetic smile. "Oh, Margaret, I should have called. Mom brought her stuffing this year, and we don't want to overwhelm the table." I was asked to bring a bag salad instead. A bag salad, while Chloe's mother, Linda, presided over the turkey and all the traditional dishes. I spent the entire dinner watching Linda receive compliments on her stuffing recipe while my contribution, a $5 bag of mixed greens, sat untouched on the counter. Emma, my only granddaughter, the light of my life, calls Linda Nana. She has special sleepovers at Nana's house, baking cookies and watching movies and painting their nails together. Emma calls me Margaret. Not Grandma, not Granny, not even Grandma Margaret. Just Margaret. Like I'm some family friend rather than the woman who held her mother's hand during 14 hours of labor, who bought the crib she slept in as a baby, who has loved her since before she drew her first breath. When I asked Michael about it once, he shrugged it off. It's just easier this way, Mom. Less confusing for her. Less confusing for whom, I wondered. But I didn't push. I never pushed. That was my mistake. I never pushed. Their house is filled with photographs, dozens of them covering every surface, hanging on every wall. Linda with Emma at the zoo, Linda and Chloe cooking together, Linda at Emma's school plays, her dance recitals, her soccer games. Even Chloe's father, who died 3 years ago, has a prominent place on their mantelpiece, surrounded by flowers and happy memories. I realized, sitting at my kitchen table that night, that I couldn't remember seeing a single photograph of myself in their house. Not one. Not from Emma's birth, not from family gatherings, not from the countless hours I'd spent in that house caring for their child. It was as if I'd been systematically edited out of their family story. One frame at a time. But here's the truly cruel part. While I'd been erased from their celebrations, their photographs, their family narrative, I was still perfectly acceptable as free labor. Margaret, could you pick up Emma from school? We're running late. Margaret, could you watch Emma this weekend? We have plans. Margaret, could you help us move this furniture? We need someone with a truck. I was good enough to babysit their daughter for free, but not good enough to be invited to her school Christmas pageant. I was reliable enough to be their emergency contact, but not important enough to be included in their family portraits. I was useful enough to call when they needed something, but not valued enough to celebrate holidays with. How had I not seen it? How had I convinced myself that this was normal, that this was just how modern families worked? I'd been so desperate to maintain my connection to Michael and Emma that I'd accepted whatever scraps of attention they threw my way, grateful for any acknowledgement at all. The cake sitting on my kitchen table wasn't just a rejected birthday treat. It was the final symbol of my place in their lives, or rather, my lack of place. For years, I'd been allowed to contribute my time, my energy, my money, my free babysitting services, but my love? My emotional investment, my desire to celebrate and be celebrated as part of the family, that was no longer welcome. Maybe it never had been welcome, and I'd just been too blind to see it. I thought about all the times I'd made excuses for them. They're busy with their own lives. Young families need space. Chloe's relationship with her mother is just different. I twisted myself into knots trying to rationalize why I felt so unwanted at gatherings in my own son's home, why my granddaughter treated me like a friendly stranger, why my contributions were always minimized or redirected. But the truth was simpler and more devastating than I'd wanted to admit. I wasn't a member of Michael's family anymore. I was a convenient service provider. I was useful when they needed free childcare or help moving heavy objects. I was tolerable when they needed someone to bring a side dish or clean up after parties. But I wasn't family, not in any way that mattered. The cake, my beautiful, perfect, lovingly crafted birthday cake, had been my last attempt to claim a place at their table that I'd already lost. Michael's words weren't just about celebrating his birthday differently. They were a formal notification that my services in the love department were no longer required. Sitting there in my kitchen, surrounded by the tools and ingredients of 35 years of maternal devotion, I finally understood something that should have been obvious much sooner. You can't bake your way back into someone's heart if they've already decided you don't belong there. The only question left was what I was going to do about it. And for the first time in years, I had an answer that had nothing to do with what Michael or Chloe or even little Emma wanted from me. I sat at that kitchen table for what felt like hours, staring at the cake box like it held the answers to questions I'd been afraid to ask. The house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking on the wall, the sound of my own breathing as I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. And then, something shifted inside me. Call it maternal instinct finally redirected, call it self-preservation kicking in, call it plain old stubborn pride. But I found myself standing up, walking to my kitchen drawer, and pulling out my sharpest knife. I opened that cake box and looked down at 35 years of tradition made manifest. 3 perfect layers of vanilla sponge, each one level and golden. Lemon buttercream frosting so smooth it looked like silk. Piped rosettes that would have made my grandmother proud. The handwritten Happy 35th Birthday Michael in script that had taken me 3 attempts to get just right. This cake was beautiful. This cake was made with skill and love and decades of experience. This cake was worthy of celebration, even if the person it was made for couldn't see its value. So I cut myself a piece. Not a small, guilty sliver. A generous, unapologetic slice that honored the work I'd put into creating something beautiful. I put it on my grandmother's best china, the rose-mattered plate that had survived the Depression and 2 world wars. I made myself a cup of tea in the matching teacup, the one I usually saved for special occasions. And then I sat down at my kitchen table and I ate my son's birthday cake. Slowly, deliberately, savoring every single bite. It was delicious. The vanilla was rich and complex, the lemon buttercream perfectly balanced between sweet and tart. The texture was exactly what I'd been aiming for. Tender crumb, silky frosting, the kind of cake that melts on your tongue and leaves you wanting more. For the first time in months, maybe years, I tasted my own cooking without the anxiety of wondering if it would be good enough, appreciated enough, loved enough by someone else. I was eating this cake for me, because I had made it with my own hands in my own kitchen, and it was good. As I ate that cake, something profound happened. I remembered who I was before I became someone who begged for acceptance at her own son's table. I remembered the woman who had built a reputation in this town for her baking, who had neighbors knocking on her door asking for recipes, who had once been asked to cater the mayor's wife's birthday party because word had gotten around about my skills. I remembered the woman who used to bake because she loved the alchemy of it. Flour and eggs and butter transformed into something that brought joy to people's faces. When had I stopped baking for the love of creation and started baking as a desperate attempt to purchase affection? I had just finished my second piece of cake. Yes, second piece, because it was that good and I was that hungry for sweetness, when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer it, but old habits die hard. Margaret? Chloe's voice was artificially bright, the tone she used when she wanted something. Michael mentioned you stopped by earlier. Listen, we were wondering if you could watch Emma on Saturday? We have a thing. Dinner with some friends from Mike's office. You know how it is. I took a breath. I looked at the remaining cake on my counter, at the plate where I'd just eaten 2 pieces of my own creation without apology, at my kitchen where I'd spent decades perfecting recipes for people who, apparently, couldn't be bothered to appreciate them. No, I said, just like that. Simple, clear, final. The silence on the other end of the phone was so complete I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Chloe's voice came back, confused and slightly irritated. What do you mean, no, you're always available on Saturdays? I mean, no, Chloe, I'm not available to babysit Emma on Saturday. I have other plans. What other plans? She asked, like the idea of me having a life outside of their convenience was inconceivable. Oh, plans that don't involve providing free childcare for people who don't celebrate with me anymore. The silence that followed was even longer this time. I could practically hear Chloe's brain trying to process this new version of Margaret, the one who said no, who had boundaries, who didn't automatically rearrange her life to accommodate their needs. Margaret, I think you're overreacting about earlier. Michael was just having a bad day. You know how stressed he gets about work. Chloe, I said, my voice steady and clear. Your husband told me, and I quote, "We don't celebrate with you anymore." That wasn't stress talking. That was a decision you two made about my place in your family. I'm simply respecting that decision. So if you don't celebrate with me, then I don't provide free services for you. It's really quite simple. She tried to argue, to explain, to manipulate me back into my familiar role as the accommodating mother-in-law who never caused problems or had needs of her own. But I wasn't that woman anymore. That woman had died on Michael's doorstep, holding a rejected birthday cake. I hung up the phone and went back to my kitchen. There was still half a cake left, and I had plans for it. Not plans to win back my son's affection or earn my granddaughter's love, or prove my worth to people who had already decided I had none. I had plans to remember what it felt like to create something beautiful for the simple joy of creation. I had plans to share my gifts with people who would appreciate them. I had plans to stop being a convenient service provider and start being a woman who knew her own worth. And it all started with eating my own cake and saying one simple word I should have learned to use years ago. No. For the first time in longer than I could remember, that word tasted sweeter than any frosting I'd ever made. The morning after I ate Michael's birthday cake and said no to Chloe, I woke up feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about baking. Not anxiety about whether it would be good enough, not worry about whether it would buy me a place at someone else's table, just pure, simple excitement about creating something beautiful with my hands. I stood in my kitchen, looking at all the cookbooks I'd collected over the decades, the recipe cards yellowed with age, the special ingredients I'd been saving for someday. Well, someday had arrived. I decided to tackle a Sachertorte, that incredibly complex Austrian chocolate cake with the apricot jam layers and the mirror-smooth chocolate glaze. I'd been intimidated by that recipe for 20 years, always telling myself it was too difficult, too time-consuming, too risky to attempt, when I had other people's expectations to meet. But I wasn't baking for other people's expectations anymore. I was baking for the challenge, for the artistry, for the simple pleasure of seeing if I could master something that had always seemed beyond my reach. It took me the entire day. The chocolate torte layers had to be paper-thin and perfectly even. The apricot jam needed to be strained and heated to just the right consistency. The chocolate glaze required a technique I'd never attempted. Tempering chocolate to create that perfect, glossy finish that doesn't bloom or streak. And it was magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. When I cut into it that evening, the layers were distinct and beautiful. Dark chocolate cake, bright orange apricot, more chocolate, then that flawless glaze on top. It tasted like something you'd order in a fancy European cafe, and I had made it in my own kitchen with my own 2 hands. I ate a piece for dinner. Just me, sitting at my kitchen table with my grandmother's china, savoring every complex flavor. Then I wrapped the rest carefully and took it to the community center the next morning, where the senior volunteers were organizing the annual charity drive. Margaret Wilson, who runs the volunteer program, took one bite and her eyes went wide. "Margaret, this is extraordinary. Where did you learn to make Sachertorte?" When I told her I'd taught myself, she insisted I bring the recipe to share. Within an hour, 3 different women had asked if I'd consider teaching a baking class at the center. A baking class. Me. Teaching other people the skills I'd been perfecting in isolation for decades. The idea had never occurred to me before, but suddenly it seemed not just possible, but exciting. I wasn't just good at baking, I was exceptional at it. I'd just been so focused on using my skills to earn love from people who didn't want it, that I'd forgotten other people might actually value what I had to offer. Over the next few weeks, I embarked on what I started thinking of as my baking adventure. Every day, I tried something new. French macarons with lavender ganache, homemade croissants that required 3 days of laminating dough, a towering croquembouche that looked like something from a fairy tale. My neighbors started stopping by, drawn by the incredible smells coming from my kitchen. Mrs. Patterson from next door, who I'd barely spoken to in 5 years, knocked on my door one afternoon when I was making fresh bread. "I hope you don't mind me asking," she said shyly, "but whatever you're baking smells like heaven. I haven't smelled bread like that since my grandmother's kitchen." I sent her home with a warm loaf and her grandmother's memories, and she came back the next day with tears in her eyes, saying it was exactly like she remembered from childhood. The real surprise came 3 weeks after the birthday cake incident. I was in the middle of making a complicated Danish pastry when my doorbell rang. When I opened it, there stood Emma, my 10-year-old granddaughter, looking small and uncertain on my front porch. "Hi, Margaret," she said in her quiet voice. "Mommy said you were sad about the cake." My heart clenched, but I managed to smile. "I was sad, sweetheart, but I'm feeling much better now. Would you like to come in?" Emma followed me into the kitchen, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. I had dough rising in 3 different bowls, flour dusting every surface, and the complex, yeasty smell of serious baking filling the air. "What are you making?" she asked, and for the first time in our relationship, I heard genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation in her voice. "Danish pastry," I told her. "It's very complicated, but also very fun. Would you like to help me shape some of the dough?" For the next 2 hours, Emma and I worked side by side in my kitchen. I taught her how to roll the dough just thin enough, how to create the traditional Danish shapes, how to brush the pastries with egg wash so they'd turn golden in the oven. She was a natural, careful with her hands, patient with the process, excited by each step. But more than that, she was present in a way she'd never been during our previous interactions. Without her parents hovering, without the strange dynamics of family gatherings, Emma relaxed into being just a little girl learning something new from her grandmother. "Why did Mommy say you were sad about a cake?" she asked while we waited for the pastries to bake. I thought carefully about how to answer. I didn't want to badmouth her parents, but I also didn't want to lie to her. "Sometimes adults have disagreements about how to do things," I said finally. "Your daddy decided he didn't want me to make birthday cakes anymore, and that hurt my feelings because I love making cakes for people I care about." Emma considered this seriously, "But you're still making things, just different things." "That's right. I realized I can make beautiful things for lots of people, not just for birthdays. And I can make them because I enjoy making them, not just because someone asked me to." "That sounds better," Emma said with the clarity that only children possess. "When I draw pictures just because I want to, they always turn out better than when someone tells me what to draw." Out of the mouths of babes. My 10-year-old granddaughter had just articulated something I'd taken 50 years to understand. That creating from joy produces better results than creating from obligation. When the Danish pastries came out of the oven, golden and beautiful and smelling like butter and possibility, Emma and I sat at my kitchen table and ate them while they were still warm. She told me about school, about her friends, about the book she was reading. I told her about the baking class I was going to start teaching, about the neighbors who had discovered my kitchen, about all the recipes I was finally brave enough to try. For the first time since she was born, Emma and I had a real conversation, not one mediated by her parents' expectations or family politics, just a grandmother and granddaughter sharing food and stories and time. When her mother came to pick her up, Emma hugged me goodbye. A real hug, not the polite, obligatory kind I'd grown accustomed to. "Can I come back and learn more baking?" she asked. "Anytime you want, sweetheart," I told her. "My kitchen is always open for people who want to create beautiful things." That night, as I cleaned flour off my counters and put away the last of the baking dishes, I realized something profound had happened. I'd found my way back to the person I used to be before I started measuring my worth by other people's approval. I was a baker, a teacher, a woman with skills worth sharing and stories worth telling. And for the first time in years, that felt like more than enough. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 5 weeks after the birthday cake incident, when Michael showed up at my door. I was in the middle of teaching my first official baking class at the community center, 6 eager students learning to make proper French bread, when my phone buzzed with angry text messages. "Mom, we need to talk. I'm coming over." I finished the class, helped my students shape their loaves for the final rise, and drove home knowing exactly what was waiting for me. Michael's car was in my driveway, and through my kitchen window I could see him pacing back and forth like a caged animal. When I opened the door, Michael pushed past me into my house without waiting for an invitation. His face was flushed with anger, his jaw set in that stubborn line I remembered from his teenage years when he didn't get his way. "What the hell is going on, Mom?" he demanded, whirling around to face me in my own living room. "First you show up uninvited to my house with that cake. Then you won't help with Emma, and now Chloe says you're being completely unreasonable about everything." I closed the front door calmly and looked at my son. Really looked at him. This tall, successful man in his expensive suit, standing in my house and yelling at me because I'd stopped providing free services on demand. When had he become someone who thought he could storm into his mother's home and make demands? "I'm not being unreasonable about anything, Michael," I said, my voice level and clear. "I'm simply respecting the boundaries you established." "What boundaries? What are you talking about?" "You told me, and I quote, 'We don't celebrate with you anymore.' Those were your exact words when I brought your birthday cake. So I'm honoring that decision. If you don't celebrate with me, then I don't provide free childcare, free labor, or free emotional availability for you." Michael's face went through several expressions: confusion, irritation, and then something that looked almost like panic as he realized what I was saying. That's not, I didn't mean, look, it's just a cake. You're being dramatic about this whole thing." "Just a cake?" I repeated, and for the first time in this conversation, my voice carried real heat. "Michael, that cake represented 35 years of never missing your birthday, 35 years of getting up early to bake from scratch, of learning your preferences, of making something beautiful with my own hands because I love you. And you dismissed it as just a cake? I didn't mean to hurt your feelings." "No, you meant to get rid of me. There's a difference." Michael started to protest, but I held out my hand to stop him. "Let me explain something to you, son. For the past several years, I have watched myself be systematically erased from your family. I bring side dishes while Linda cooks the important food. Emma calls her Nana and calls me Margaret. Your house is full of photos of Linda's family, but none of me. I'm good enough to babysit for free, but not important enough to be invited to school plays." "Mom, that's not—" I'm not finished. My voice carried an authority I hadn't used with Michael since he was a child, and it stopped him cold. I convinced myself this was normal, that this was just how modern families worked. I made excuses for every slight, every dismissal, every time I was made to feel like an outsider in my own son's life. But that birthday cake was my breaking point. It wasn't about the cake itself. It was about what the cake represented. It was my love, my effort, my desire to be part of celebrating your life, and you handed it back to me like it was worthless." Michael's anger was deflating, replaced by something that looked like uncomfortable recognition. "Mom, we just wanted to do things differently this year." "No, Michael, you wanted to do things without me, and that's your choice to make. But it's also my choice to stop pretending that's acceptable. So, when Chloe calls asking for free babysitting, I say no. When you need help moving furniture or running errands, I'm not available. When you want someone to bring food to your gatherings while being treated like the help, I have other plans." Michael's face was turning red again, but this time it wasn't entirely anger. There was embarrassment there too, and maybe even shame. "Mom, you're being ridiculous. Family helps family. That's how it works." "Family celebrates family too, Michael. Family includes each other in important moments. Family doesn't systematically erase each other from photographs and traditions and holiday tables. So, if I'm not family enough to celebrate with, then I'm not family enough to serve." "It's not like that." "It's exactly like that." Michael tried several more times to argue, to minimize what he'd done, to make me feel guilty for setting boundaries. He accused me of being petty, of holding grudges, of overreacting to something that wasn't a big deal. But I had found my strength, and I wasn't giving it back. "Michael," I said finally, when he'd run out of ways to blame me for his own behavior, "you made a choice when you closed that door with my cake in my hands. You chose to exclude me from your celebrations, your traditions, your family life. And I've made a choice too. I choose to stop begging for acceptance from people who have already decided I'm not worth accepting. I choose to stop giving my time and energy and love to people who take it for granted. I choose to stop measuring my worth by whether or not you want me around." Michael stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. What does that mean? It means, I said, walking to my front door and opening it wide, that you told me very clearly where I stand in your life, and I heard you. So from now on, that's exactly where I'll stand, outside your life, living my own. Beckman. It was never about the cake, Michael. It was about the hand that baked it. And you made it very clear you no longer want what I have to offer. Michael stood there for a long moment, looking like he wanted to argue more, but finally understanding that his old tactics weren't going to work anymore. The mother who used to apologize for having feelings, who used to accept whatever scraps of attention he threw her way, was gone. He left without another word, and I closed the door behind him with the same calm finality he'd used on me 5 weeks earlier. But this time, I was the one walking away from something that no longer served me. And for the first time in years, that felt like exactly the right thing to do. It's been 6 months since Michael stormed out of my house, 6 months since I stopped accepting the unacceptable. And I want to tell you what my life looks like now, because it's nothing like what I expected when I first stood on that doorstep holding a rejected birthday cake. I'm in my kitchen right now, and behind me is a sackertort that would make any Viennese pastry chef proud. Not because anyone asked me to make it, not because it's someone's birthday or because I'm trying to earn my way back into anyone's good graces. I'm making it because I woke up this morning and thought, today feels like a sackertort day. That's what freedom tastes like, the ability to create beautiful things simply because you want to, because you can, because the act of creation brings you joy. My baking classes at the community center have a waiting list now. Every Tuesday and Thursday, my kitchen is full of eager students learning to make everything from basic bread to complex pastries. These women, and a few brave men, don't just want to learn techniques. They want to understand the alchemy of baking, the way heat and time and patience can transform simple ingredients into something extraordinary. Margaret Wilson asked me last week if I'd consider catering her daughter's wedding. When I told her I'd never done anything that large before, she laughed. Margaret, you've been feeding this town's heart one cake at a time for decades. We trust you. Emma comes to visit me every other Saturday now, not because her parents need free babysitting, but because she wants to learn. Last week, we made croissants from scratch, a 3-day process that requires patience and precision and the kind of quiet focus that children rarely get to experience in their overscheduled lives. She's gotten good at it, my granddaughter, really good. She has steady hands and an intuitive understanding of dough texture that can't be taught. More importantly, she's learned that creating something beautiful is its own reward, independent of anyone else's approval or appreciation. Michael and Chloe still live across town. They still need babysitters and help with household projects and someone to bring food to their gatherings. But they've had to find other people to fill those roles, because I meant what I said that day in my living room. I'm not angry anymore. Anger was just the bridge I had to cross to get to something better, self-respect. I don't wish them ill. I simply wish them nothing at all, because they've made it clear that's what they want from me. You know what I've learned in these 6 months? Love that has to be earned isn't love at all. It's employment. And I'd been working at a job that paid me in scraps and criticism and the occasional grudging acknowledgement that I was useful. Real love doesn't make you smaller. It doesn't ask you to apologize for taking up space or having needs or wanting to be celebrated. Real love doesn't hand your heart back to you and call it just a cake. So if you're watching this and recognizing yourself in my story, if you're the one always giving, always accommodating, always making excuses for people who treat your love like an inconvenience, let this be your sign. You don't have to keep baking cakes for people who won't even open the door. You don't have to keep offering your heart to people who hand it back unwrapped. You don't have to keep explaining why you deserve basic kindness and inclusion from the people who claim to love you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for them and for yourself is to stop. Stop trying to earn what should be freely given. Stop accepting crumbs when you deserve the whole cake. Stop making yourself smaller so other people can feel bigger. Take that love, that care, that incredible capacity for creating sweetness in the world, and bring it home to yourself. Find people who celebrate your gifts instead of taking them for granted. Discover what it feels like to create from joy instead of obligation. This is what the other side looks like. It's not bitter or lonely or sad, even though that's what I was afraid it would be. It's warm and flower-dusted and full of the smell of butter and vanilla and possibility. It's students who hang on your every word and neighbors who stop by just to see what magic you're creating today. It's Saturday mornings spent teaching your granddaughter that she has capable hands and a good heart. And that's enough. It's Tuesday evenings with women who understand that baking is love made visible, and they treat your knowledge like the treasure it is. Most of all, it's the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you're worth celebrating, even if, especially if, you have to be the one to light the candles. I'm 73 years old, and I'm just now learning to throw my own party. But it turns out I'm very good at celebrations when they're for someone who actually wants to be there, me. If you enjoyed this story about finding the courage to value yourself as much as you value others, please subscribe to our channel. There are so many of us learning to light our own candles, and we need to know we're not alone in choosing ourselves for once. The cake is ready, and for the first time in my life, so am I.